Chapter 25 of the Opal Serpent by Fergus Hume. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A cruel woman. "Just say your meaning, my pretty queen," said Mrs. Tawsey, as she stood at the sitting room door and watched Sylvia reading an ill-written letter. "It's 12 now, and I can be back by 5, after a long and enjoyable talk with Matilda." "You certainly must go," replied Sylvia, handing back the letter. "I am sure your sister will be glad to see you, Debby." Deborah sniffed and scratched her elbow. "Relatives ain't friends in our family," she said, shaking her head. "Whatever you may say, my dearie sweet. Father knocked mother into lunatics after she nagged him to drunk and police cells. 3 brothers I had, and all of 'em that handy with their fists that they couldn't bear to live in harmony without black eyes and swollen bumps all over them. As to Matilda, she and me never did what you might call hit it off, by reason of her not giving way to me as she should have done, me being the youngest and what you might call the baby of the lot. We ain't seen each other for years, and the meeting will be cold. She'll not have much forgiveness for me being a bride, and she but a lone cross patch, drat her." "Don't quarrel with her, Debby. She has written you a very nice letter, asking you to go down to Mrs. Krill's house in Kensington, and she really wants to see you before she goes back to Christchurch to night." "Well, I'll go," said Deborah, suddenly, "but I don't like leaving you all by your own very self, my sunflower." "I'll be all right, Debby. Paul comes at 4 o'clock, and you'll be back at 5. Sooner if me and Matilda don't hit it off, or if we hit each other, which, knowing her habits, I do expects. But Bart's out to 6, and there won't be any one to look after them as washes 4 of 'em," added Mrs. Tawsey, rubbing her nose, "and as idle as porkpines." "Mrs. Purr can look after them." "Look after gin, more like," said Deborah, contemptuously. "She's always sucking, sly like, trying to pretend as it's water, as if the smell didn't give it away, whatever the color may be. And here she is, idling as usual. And I may ask, Mrs. Purr, ma'am," demanded Deborah with great politeness, "what I pays you for in the way of ironing?" But Mrs. Purr was too excited to reply. She brushed past her indignant mistress and faced Sylvia, waving a dirty piece of paper. "Lor', miss," she almost screamed, "you do say as you want to know where that limb Tray have got to?" "Yes, yes," said Sylvia, rising. "He escaped from Mr. Hurd, and we want to find him very much." "It's a letter from him," said Mrs. Purr, thrusting the paper into Sylvia's hand. "That's how he writes, not having been to a board school. I don't know. He's in a ken at Lambeth, and ill at that. Wants me to go and see him, but I can't leave the ironing." "Yes, you can," said Deborah, suddenly. "This errand is necessary, Mrs. Purr, ma'am, so just put on your bunnet and go to Mr. Hurd, as his office is at Scotland Yard, and take him with you." "Oh, but I couldn't." "You go," advised Mrs. Tawsey. "There's £5 offered for the brat's being found." "£5!" gasped Mrs. Purr, trembling. "Lord, and me having a chance of getting it. I'll go, I'll go. I knows the Yard, having had something to do with them dirty police in my time. Miss Sylvia." "Yes, go, Mrs. Purr, and see Mr. Hurd. He'll give you the £5 if you take him to Tray." Sylvia handed back the paper. "Tray seems to be ill." "Ill or well, he shan't lose me those £5 if I have to drag him into the lock up myself," said Mrs. Purr, resolutely. "Where's my bonnet, my shawl, and oh Lord, £5. Them as is good always gets the rewards." And she hurried out, hardly able to walk for excitement. "There's a nice old party for you, Miss Sylvia." "Debby," said the girl, thoughtfully, "you take her to the Yard to see Mr. Hurd, and then go to Kensington and speak with your sister." "Well, I'll go, as important it is," said Mrs. Tawsey, rubbing her nose harder than ever. But I hopes you won't be lone, my poppet dovey." "Oh, no," said Sylvia, kissing her and pushing her towards the door. "I'll look after those 4 women in the wash house, and read this new book I have. Then I must get tea ready for Paul, who comes at 4. The afternoon will pass quite quickly." "I'll be back at 5 if I can, and earlier if Matilda ain't what she ought to be," said Mrs. Tawsey, yielding. "So make yourself happy, honey, till you see me smiling again." In another quarter of an hour Mrs. Tawsey, dressed in her bridal gown and bonnet so as to crush Matilda with the sight of her splendor, walked down the garden path attended by Mrs. Purr in a snuffy black shawl, and a kind of cobweb on her head which she called a bunnet. As Deborah was tall and in white, and Mrs. Purr small and in black, they looked a strange pair. Sylvia waved her hand out of the window to Debby as the faithful creature turned her head for a final look at the young mistress she idolized. The large, rough woman was doglike in her fidelity. Sylvia, left alone, proceeded to arrange matters. She went to the wash house, which was detached from the cottage, and saw that the 4 women who worked under Deborah were busy. She found them all chattering and washing in a cheerful way. So after a word or two of commendation, she returned to the sitting room. Here she played a game of patience, arranged the tea things, although it was yet early, and finally settled down to one of Mrs. Henry Wood's interesting novels. She was quite alone and enjoyed the solitude. The wash house was so far away at the end of the yard that the loud voices of the workers could not be heard. The road before Rose Cottage was not a popular thoroughfare, and it was rarely that anyone passed. Out of the window Sylvia could see a line of raw, red brick villas, and sometimes a spurt of steam, denoting the presence of the railway station. Also she saw the green fields and the sere hedges with the red berries, giving promise of a hard winter. The day was sunny but cold, and there was a feeling of autumnal dampness in the air. Deborah had lighted a fire before she went, that her mistress might be comfortable. So Sylvia sat down before this and read for an hour, frequently stopping to think of Paul, and wonder if he would come at the appointed hour of 4 or earlier. With the warmth and the reading and the dreaming, she fell into a kind of doze, from which she was awakened by a sharp and peremptory knock. Wondering if her lover had unexpectedly arrived, though she did not think he would rap in so decided a manner, Sylvia rubbed the sleep out of her pretty eyes and hurried to the door. On the step she came face to face with Miss Maud Krill. "Do you know me, Miss Norman?" asked Maud, who was smiling and suave, though rather white in the face. "Yes, you came with your mother to Gwynne Street," replied Sylvia, wondering why she had been honored with a visit. "Quite so. May I have a few minutes of conversation with you?" "Certainly." Sylvia saw no reason to deny this request, although she did not like Miss Krill. But it struck her that something might be learned from that young woman relative to the murder, and thought she would have something to tell Paul about when he arrived. "Will you walk in, please?" and she threw open the sitting room door. "Are you quite alone?" asked Maud, entering and seating herself in the chair near the fire. "Quite," answered Sylvia, stiffly, and wondering why the question was asked. "That is, the 4 washerwomen are in the place at the back, but Mrs. Tawsey went to your house to see her sister." "She arrived before I left," said Maud, coolly. "I saw them quarrelling in a most friendly way. Where is Mr. Beecot?" "I expect him later." "And Bart Tawsey, who married your nurse?" "He is absent on his rounds." "May I ask why you question me in this way, Miss Krill?" asked Sylvia, coldly. "Because I have much to say to you which no one else must hear," was the calm reply. "Dear me, how hot this fire is!" and she moved her chair so that it blocked Sylvia's way to the door. Also Miss Krill cast a glance at the window. It was not snibbed, and she made a movement as if to go to it, but restraining herself, she turned her calm, cold face to the girl. "I have much to say to you," she repeated. "Indeed," replied Sylvia, politely. "I don't think you have treated me so well that you should trouble to converse with me. Will you please to be brief? Mr. Beecot is coming at 4, and he will not be at all pleased to see you." Maud glanced at the clock. "We have an hour," she said coldly. "It is just a few minutes after 3. My business will not take long," she added with an unpleasant smile. "What is your business?" asked Sylvia, uneasily, for she did not like the smile. "If you will sit down, I'll tell you." Miss Norman took a chair near the wall, and as far from her visitor as was possible in so small a room. Maud took from her neck a black silk handkerchief which she wore, evidently as a protection against the cold, and folding it lengthwise, laid it across her lap. Then she looked at Sylvia in a cold, critical way. "You are very pretty, my dear," she said insolently. "Did you come to tell me that?" asked the girl, firing up at the tone. "No, I came to tell you that my mother was arrested last night for the murder of our father." "Oh!" Sylvia gasped, and lay back on her chair. "She killed him, that cruel woman." "She did not," cried Maud, passionately. "My mother is perfectly innocent. That blackguard Hurd arrested her wrongfully. I overheard all the conversation he had with her, and know that he told a pack of lies. My mother did not kill our father." "My father, not yours," said Sylvia, firmly. "How dare you? Lemuel Krill was my father." "No," insisted Sylvia. "I don't know who your father was, but from your age I know that you are not." "Leave my age alone," cried the other sharply, and with an uneasy movement of her hands. "We won't discuss that or the question of my father. We have more interesting things to talk about." "I won't talk to you at all," said Sylvia, rising. "Sit down and listen. You shall hear me. I am not going to let my mother suffer for a deed she never committed, nor am I going to let you have the money." "It's mine." "It is not, and you shall not get it." "Paul, Mr. Beecot will assert my rights." "Will he indeed?" said the other with a glance at the clock. "We'll see about that. There's no time to be lost. I have much to say." "Nothing that can interest me." "Oh, yes. I think you will find our conversation very interesting. I am going to be open with you, for what I tell you will never be told by you to any living soul." "If I see fit it shall," cried Sylvia in a rage. "How dare you dictate to me?" "Because I am driven into a corner. I wish to save my mother. How it is to be done I don't know. I wish to stop you getting the 5,000 a year. I know how that is to be done," ended Miss Krill, with a cruel smile and a flash of her white, hungry looking teeth. "You rat of a girl." "Leave the room." "When I please, not before. You listen to me. I'm going to tell you about the murder." "Oh!" said Sylvia, turning pale. "What do you mean?" "Listen," said the other, with a taunting laugh. "You'll be white enough before I've done with you. Do you see this?" And she laid her finger on her lips. "Do you see this scar? Krill did that." Sylvia noticed that she did not speak of Krill as her father this time. "He pinned my lips together when I was a child with that opal serpent." "I know," replied Sylvia, shuddering. "It was cruel. I heard about it from the detective, and I do not wish for your sympathy. I was a girl of 15 when that was done, and I will carry the scar to my grave. Child as I was then, I vowed revenge." "On your father?" said Sylvia, contemptuously. "Krill is not my father," said Maud, changing front all at once. "He is yours, but not mine. My father is Captain Jessop. I have known this for years. Captain Jessop told me I was his daughter. My mother thought that my father was drowned at sea, and so married Krill, who was a traveller in jewellery. He and my mother rented the Red Pig at Christchurch, and for years they led an unhappy life." "Oh!" gasped Sylvia. "You confess? I'll tell Paul." "You'll tell no one," retorted the other woman, sharply. "Do Do you think I would speak so openly in order that you might tell all the world with your gabbling tongue? Yes, and I'll speak more openly still before I leave. Lady Rachel Sandal did not commit suicide, as my mother said. She was strangled, and by me." Sylvia clapped her hands to her face with a scream. "By you?" "Yes, she had a beautiful brooch. I wanted it. I was put to bed by my mother and kept thinking of the brooch. My mother was down the stairs attending to your drunken father. I stole to Lady Rachel's room and found her asleep. I tried to take the brooch from her breast. She woke and caught at my hand. But I tore the brooch away, and before Lady Rachel could scream, I twisted the silk handkerchief she wore, which was already round her throat, tighter. I'm strong. I was always strong, even as a girl of 15. She was weak from exhaustion, so she soon died. My mother came into the room and saw what I had done. She was terrified and made me go back to bed. Then she tied Lady Rachel by the silk handkerchief to the bedpost, so that it might be thought she had committed suicide. My mother then came back to me and took the brooch, telling me I might be hanged if it was found on me. I was afraid, being only a girl, and gave up the brooch. Then Captain Jessop raised the alarm. I and my mother went downstairs, and my mother dropped the brooch on the floor, so that it might be supposed Lady Rachel had lost it there. Captain Jessop ran out. I wanted to give the alarm and tell the neighbors that Krill had done it, for I knew then he was not my father, and I saw, moreover, how unhappy he made my mother. He caught me," said Maud, with a fierce look, "and bound a handkerchief across my mouth. I got free and screamed. Then he bound me hand and foot, and pinned my lips together with the brooch which he picked off the floor. My mother fought for me, but he knocked her down. Then he fled, and after a long time Jessop came in. He removed the brooch from my mouth and unbound me. I was put to bed, and Jessop revived my mother. Then came the inquest, and it was thought that Lady Rachel had committed suicide. But she did not," cried Maud, exultingly, and with a cruel light in her eyes. "I killed her, I." "Oh," moaned Sylvia, backing against the wall with widely opened eyes. "Don't tell me more. What horrors!" "Bah, you kitten," sneered Maud, contemptuously. "I have not half done yet. You have yet to hear how I killed Krill." Sylvia shrieked and sank back into her chair, staring with horrified eyes at the cruel face before her. "Yes," cried Maud, exultingly, "I killed him. My mother suspected me, but she never knew for certain. Listen. When Hay told me that Krill was hiding as Norman in Gwynne Street, I determined to punish him for his cruelty to me. I did not say this, but I made Hay promise to get me the brooch from Beecot. On no other condition would I marry him. I wanted the brooch to pin Krill's lips together, as he had pinned mine when I was a helpless child. But your fool of a lover would not part with the brooch. Tray, the boy, took it from Beecot's pocket when he met with the accident." "How do you know Tray?" "Because I met him at Pash's office several times when I was up. He ran errands for Pash before he became regularly employed. I saw that Tray was a devil of whom I could make use. Oh, I know Tray, and I also know Hokar, the Indian, who placed the sugar on the counter. He went to the shop to kill your father at my request. I wanted revenge and the money. Hokar was saved from starvation by my good mother. He came of a race of thugs, if you know anything about them." "Oh," moaned Sylvia, covering her face again. "Ah, you do. So much the better. It will save my explaining, as there is not much time left before your fool arrives. Hokar saw that I loved to hurt living creatures, and he taught me how to strangle cats and dogs and things. No one knew but Hokar that I killed them, and it was thought he ate them, but he didn't. I strangled them because I loved to see them suffer, and because I wished to learn how to strangle in the way the thugs did." Sylvia was sick with fear and disgust. "For God's sake, don't tell me any more," she said imploringly. But she might as well have spoken to a granite rock. "You shall hear everything," said Maud, relentlessly. "I asked Hokar to strangle Krill. He went to the shop, but when he saw that Krill had only one eye, he could not offer him to the goddess Bhowanee. He came to me at Judson's hotel, after he left the sugar on the counter, and told me the goddess would not accept the offering of a maimed man. I did not know what to do. I went with my mother to Pash's office when she was arranging to prosecute Krill for bigamy. I met Tray there. He told me he had given the brooch to Pash, and that it was in the inner office. My mother was talking to Pash within, and I chatted to Tray outside. I told Tray I wanted to kill Krill, and that if he would help me, I would give him a lot of money. He agreed, for he was a boy such as I was when a girl, fond of seeing things suffer. You can't wonder at it in me," went on Mrs. Krill coolly. "My grandmother was hanged for poisoning my grandfather, and I expect I inherit the love of murder from her." "I won't listen," cried Sylvia, shuddering. "Oh, yes, you will. I'll soon be done," went on her persecutor, cruelly. "Well, then, when I found Tray was like myself, I determined to get the brooch and hurt Krill. Hurt him as he hurt me," she cried vehemently. "Tray told me of the cellar and of the side passage. When my mother and Pash came out of the inner office and went to the door, I ran in and took the brooch. It was hidden under some papers and had escaped my mother's eyes, but I searched till I got it. Then I made an appointment with Tray for 11 o'clock at the corner of Gwynne Street. I went back to Judson's hotel, and my mother and I went to the theatre. We had supper and retired to bed. That is, my mother did. We had left the theatre early, as my mother had a headache, and I had plenty of time. Mother fell asleep almost immediately. I went downstairs veiled and in dark clothes. I slipped past the night porter and met Tray. We went by the side passage to the cellar. Thinking we were customers, Krill let us in. Tray locked the door, and I threw myself on Krill. He had not been drinking much, or I might not have mastered him. As it was, he was too terrified when he recognized me to struggle. In fact, he fainted. With Tray's assistance, I bound his hands behind his back, and then we enjoyed ourselves. She rubbed her hands together, looking more like a fiend than a woman. Sylvia rose and staggered to the door. "No more, no more." Maud pushed her back into her chair. "Stop where you are, you whimpering fool," she snarled exultingly. "I have you safe." Then she continued quickly, with another glance at the clock, the long hand of which now pointed to 3:15. "With Tray's assistance, I carried Krill up to the shop. Tray found an auger and bored a hole in the floor. Then I picked up a coil of copper wire which was being used in packing things for Krill to make his escape. I took it up. We laid Krill's neck over the hole and passed the wire round his neck and through the hole. Tray went down and tied a cross stick on the end of the wire, so that he could put his weight on it when we strangled." "Oh, great heaven!" moaned Sylvia, stopping her ears. Maud bent over her and pulled her hands away. "You shall hear, you little beast," she snarled. "All the time Krill was sensible. He recovered his senses after he was bound. I prolonged his agony as much as possible. When Tray went down to see after the wire, I knelt beside Krill and told him that I knew I was not his daughter, that I intended to strangle him as I had strangled Lady Rachel. He shrieked with horror. That was the cry you heard, you cat, which brought you downstairs. I never expected that," cried Maud, clapping her hands. "That was a treat for Krill I never intended. I stopped his crying any more for assistance by pinning his mouth together, as he had done mine over 20 years before. Then I sat beside him and taunted him. I heard the policeman pass and the church clock strike the quarter. Then I heard footsteps and guessed you were coming. It occurred to me to give you a treat by strangling the man before your eyes, and punish him more severely, since the brooch stopped him calling out, as it stopped me. Me!" she cried, striking her breast. "Oh, how could you? How could " "You feeble thing," said Maud, contemptuously, and patting the girl's cheek. "You would not have done it, I know. But I loved it. I loved it. That was living indeed. I went down to the cellar and fastened the door behind me. Tray was already pressing on the cross stick at the end of the wire, and laughed as he pressed. But I stopped him. I heard you and that woman enter the shop, and heard what you said. I prolonged Krill's agony, and then I pressed the wire down myself for such a time as I thought it would take to squeeze the life out of the beast. Then with Tray I locked the cellar door and left by the side passage. We dodged all the police and got into the Strand. I did not return to the hotel, but walking around with Tray all night, talking with joy," cried Maud, clapping her hands. "With joy, do you hear? When it was 8 I went to Judson's. The porter thought I had been out for an early walk. My mother " Here Maud broke off, for Sylvia, who was staring over her shoulder out of the window, saw a form she knew well at the gate. "Paul! Paul!" she shrieked. "Come! Come!" Maud whipped the black silk handkerchief round the girl's neck. "You shall never get the money," she whispered cruelly. "You shall never tell anyone what I have told you. Now I'll show you how Hokar taught me." She jerked the handkerchief tight. But Sylvia got her hand under the cruel bandage and shrieked aloud in despair. At once she heard an answering shriek. It was the voice of Deborah. Maud darted to the door and locked it. Then she returned, and flinging Sylvia down, tried again to tighten the handkerchief, her face white and fierce, her eyes glittering like a demon's. "Help! Help!" cried Sylvia, and her voice grew weaker. But she struggled and kept her hands between the handkerchief and her throat. Maud tried to drag them away fiercely. Deborah was battering frantically at the door. Paul ran round to the window. It was not locked, and Maud, struggling with Sylvia, had no time to close it. With a cry of alarm, Paul threw up the window and jumped into the room. At the same moment, Deborah, putting her sturdy shoulder to the frail door, burst it open. Beecot flung himself on the woman and dragged her back, but she clung like a leech to Sylvia with the black handkerchief in her grip. Deborah, silent and fierce, grabbed at the handkerchief and tore it from Maud's grasp. Sylvia, half strangled, fell back in a faint, white as a corpse, while Paul struggled with the savage and baffled woman. "You've killed her!" shouted Deborah, and laid her strong hands on Maud. "You devil!" She shook her fiercely. "I'll kill you!" And she shook her again. Paul threw himself on his knees beside the insensible form of Sylvia, and left Deborah to deal with Maud. That creature was gasping as Mrs. Tawsey swung her to and fro. Then she began to fight, and the two women crashed round the little room, upsetting the furniture. Paul took Sylvia in his arms and shrank against the wall to protect her. A new person suddenly appeared, no less a woman than Matilda. When she saw Maud in Deborah's grip, she flew at her sister like a tigress and dragged her off. Maud was free for a moment. Seeing her chance, she scrambled out of the window and ran through the garden down the road toward the station. Perhaps she had a vague idea of escape. Deborah, exerting her great strength, threw Matilda aside, and without a cry ran out of the house and after the assassin who had tried to strangle Sylvia. Matilda, true to her salt, ran also to help Maud Krill, and the two women sped in the wake of the insane creature who was swiftly running in the direction of the station. People began to look round, a crowd gathered like magic, and in a few moments Maud was being chased by quite a mob of people. She ran like a hare. Heaven only knows if she hoped to escape after her failure to kill Sylvia, but she ran on blindly. Into the new street of Jubileetown she sped with a roaring mob at her heels. She darted down a side thoroughfare, but Deborah gained on her silently and with a savage look in her eyes. Several policemen joined in the chase, though no one knew what the flying woman had done. Maud turned suddenly up the slope that led to the station. She gained the door, darted through it, upset the man at the barrier, and, with clenched fists, stood at bay, her back to the rails. Deborah darted forward. Maud gave a wild scream and sprang aside. Then she reeled and fell over the platform. The next moment a train came slowing into the station, and immediately the wretched woman was under the cruel wheels. When she was picked up she was dead and almost cut to pieces. Lady Rachel and Lemuel Krill were revenged. End of chapter 25.